Welcome, everybody. I have asked Maggie Morton to come and talk to us about interviewing trauma survivors because she does that as a professional all the time. And she has some great advice for law students and lawyers. Maggie Morton received her master's degree in social work in 1992, and she's a licensed clinical social worker. She has provided counseling for nearly 30 years. Is that right?
That's true.
For individuals and couples in private practice. And for many years, she also did individual and group counseling at Cottonwood de Tucson, which is an internationally renowned inpatient treatment center here in Tucson. Maggie works with people to improve their sense of well-being and their ability to create healthy relationships with others, and their ability to live with joy, integrity, and hope.
Great. Lynn, thank you so much for asking me here. This is kind of a treat to be able to do this. Lynn is an immigration lawyer who ran an immigration law clinic at the James E. Rogers College of Law at the University of Arizona for 25 years, and now heads an immigration placement clinic with externships at the law school. She's also taught refugee law for many years. Lynn lives here in Tucson with her husband, 2 kids, 2 dogs, and likes hiking, biking, and eating chocolate.
And Maggie lives here in Tucson with her husband, 2 cats, 2 dogs, 1 cat, and like skiing, scuba diving, reading, singing, Zumba. And thanks to COVID, she is now an avid bread maker.
Sad but true. Yeah.
I thought we should start with this. From a mental health perspective, what is trauma?
Generally speaking, the original definitions of trauma included someone either experiencing or witnessing an event that could have been life-threatening. And that's how a lot of the literature about trauma began, like it had to be a life or death experience. That is not true. We really found now that the effects of trauma can come from relatively subtle events sometimes. We can also say that those events that really change the direction of your life, the things that change how you see yourself and how you experience the world, those are often traumatic.
Okay, so it's a pretty broad definition.
It can be, yeah.
So when we talk about trauma-informed lawyering, we're specifically talking about practices that take into account the ways that trauma impacts our relationship with our clients, and also, how they interact with players in the system, and adjusting our practices accordingly. So to do that, I think we first need to understand how trauma typically does impact people, and that's a very big topic. Obviously, it varies with all sorts of factors, but what are some common reactions that people have to trauma?
Well, I should say first that virtually everyone who's gone through a trauma is going to have some short-term effects from that. But not everybody is going to have those long-term symptoms that make up post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. PTSD affects people there's sort of 3 groups of symptoms that you're going to see with PTSD. So the first is intrusion. That's the intrusion of the memories of the event, usually in nightmares or something called a flashback. A flashback is a memory so visceral that you're kind of there for a minute. You're re-experiencing the trauma. They're awful. The next is going to be a group of symptoms of arousal, hyperarousal. So hyperarousal is going to mean things like irritability, something called an exaggerated startle response. You might see that in your office. Someone slams the door down the hall and someone goes, big jumps like that. And it's just because the part of our nervous system is trying to stay ready. So it's going to be on alert a lot. States of like insomnia, all sorts of stuff, like, because as I said, you're trying to stay ready. The third grouping is avoidance, and that's going to look one of 2 ways. Either that's avoiding any memory of the traumatic event, so people and places and cars and like can't drive there and stuff like that. The other half of that is dissociation, or avoiding yourself. And dissociation is something you're almost certain to, you're certain to see because it's one of the most common effects of trauma. And generally speaking, it's sort of like someone gets unplugged a little bit. So they can talk about the event as though they're reading a cereal box. Like there's no emotion shown at all because they've kind of unclipped their connection to it, their emotional connection to it.
So, how do those symptoms, how do those ways of responding to trauma, how can those come into the room with us? Like how can those affect our interaction
Sure.
with our clients?
Well, kind of in all ways. The thing that I was just discussing, the dissociation, sometimes that's going to mean that someone's relating a horrifying event with no affect at all. And that's tricky because if that's in a courtroom, it's going to look as though they're making it up or they're not feeling it much. But actually something is just disengaged for them. You're also going to see people get very aroused as they're speaking. So lots of tears or maybe shaking, GI upset, all sorts of people get queasy. It's really hard for people to talk about some of the stuff. You're also going to hear them sort of talk through it. It's really common for people to sort of say, maybe I did this, maybe I caused, and I'm imagining that would be really troubling legally because it's really common in trauma to doubt yourself. Did I do something wrong? Was I in the wrong place? Maybe I did such and such. So that's probably something to be watchful for. All sorts of, negative thoughts. It's so interesting to me to think how different it is for different people as they're recounting trauma. Some folks are going to be able to be kind of present and go through a really direct timeline, give you a really clear idea of the event. Those folks are probably in the minority because since trauma affects the brain in certain ways, it's not your cerebellum that's leading this. It's not your cerebral cortex, it's old brain. So you're going to get choppy narratives, stories kind of out of sequence, stories that people are telling, particularly early on, where their affect changes a lot, lots of arousal and then flat. And none of that means that someone's making something up. It just means that they're kind of ratcheting around with their own response to it.
So, and chronology might not be possible or might be off?
Well, I'm assuming that you guys are going to have some length of time to prepare. So it's not like you have to go with a first interview, boom, but it's very likely that in the first interview, you might get chronology that's out of order or stuff that people kind of get overwhelmed talking about. It's really common that for people telling their story over time, it can settle your system down a little bit so that it's not quite as overwhelming. And if you have the time with the client, you might be able to put together the chronological events more clearly. But as you're first interviewing somebody, it's going to be a little choppy.
Okay, so there are a lot of challenges in this interaction. What practical tips do you have to offer us?
Well, this is the very first piece that I think about, and I'll say this to somebody in my office. One of the things that makes something traumatic is that it's not in your control. So anything you can do to give somebody control is useful. Where do they sit? People are not going to want to sit with their back to the door, or sometimes even with their back to the window. You're going to see people choose the chair in the corner. Let them. People are going to want to pace the way that they tell their story. There are some folks who are going to be spilling it, right? There's some urgency to telling the story. There are some folks for whom it's just going to be such a painful thing that it's kind of pulling teeth. So if the more time you have with them to let that story unfold at their pace is really helpful. You can also say that, some of the things that people are going to be doing in the moment can be self-soothing. So, what are the things that the client needs? And sometimes you can just ask them, is there something that you would need to make this more comfortable for you to tell me? Stuff like that. Sometimes people will say, yeah, I want a glass of water, or yeah, I want to take a break, or, stuff like that. So saying overtly, I want you to have as much control in this as you can be helpful. And just like in any other situation, obviously you're trying to build rapport, you're trying to earn trust. And there are some ways to do that when you're working with trauma. And it's a tricky balance. This is tricky. When someone's telling you a god-awful story, you've got a tough balance to strike to say, I want to respond appropriately so that they think I'm not dismissive of it. But I'm also not wanting to go, oh my God, because then they'll think they have to take care of me, or they'll think it's like their story is so out there that it's almost shameful to say. So for us, it's really important to try to find that balance between saying, wow, that sounds so painful. Wow, that's big. Can you tell me some more? Can you tell me what happened next? Can you tell me what that was like for you? So that you're there. I mean, you're there. That's the message. And I say that a lot, like to be able to be present with them. And sometimes that's going to mean that we have to calm ourselves down quite a bit if we're hearing something just ghastly. Mm-hmm. So also, you don't want to hit the chair, let's get into the trauma, like hit the ground running. You really want to kind of slide into that a little bit or bookend it a little bit. So when you're first talking about somebody, just basics, how is this? How are you? Did you sleep okay? Kind of chit chat, and then ease in, funnel in a little bit to something that's a little bit more challenging, and then prep somebody. So we're going to be talking about some tough stuff today, and here's why. So super important to be able to tell them why on earth you're making them do this. For me to be able to be as helpful to you as I can, it's really helpful that I know what you went through in some detail. So that's why we're doing this, so that of course they know they're acting in their own best interest when they're able to tell you their story. And then again, if you've got an hour and a half with someone, if you've got 5 minutes left and they're just starting to open something up, oh no, don't do that. Make sure that you have some time at the end, and I would say at least probably 15 minutes at the end, to say, we're going to change the channel. We're going to talk about things that aren't trauma-based. We're going to talk about sort of the procedures. Here's what happens. Can I get you some water? How you doing? Just make sure that you have time to kind of let things settle.
And I want to say, you said to us before, when you come to talk to class, it can be dangerous for somebody to just go out without having settled. Because I know if I'm really upset and driving, sometimes, I miss where I'm supposed to go, or I'm just not paying attention.
I read a study that said it was very much like driving drunk. So you don't want somebody to leave scrambled. You most particularly don't want someone to leave dissociated. And so let me talk about dissociation a little bit more specifically. As I said, it can look like a disconnection. It can also be what causes that super flat affect. So that somebody's just blah, 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 this happened and this happened and this happened, like they're not responding at all. If you suspect that someone's strongly dissociative, sometimes you can see it. They've kind of got the 1,000-yard stare. They're responding sort of slowly. They just don't seem like they're in their skin. I ask people, how here are you? And often people know what I mean by that. But they say, what do you mean? How here? Like, how much are you here in your skin? How much are you here in this room? And if somebody says, half and half, I sometimes even ask people to rate it on 1 out of 10. How here are you? If they're not saying an 8, they're not getting in their car. So it's my job to make sure that somebody is put together enough, bookended enough, that they're going to be safe to drive if they have to leave and drive. So we can talk about some grounding, certainly, but that's a tricky one. You're going to really want to make sure that they're safe to leave.
Yeah, and could you said we're going to talk about some grounding. I mean, I think it's, maybe even not just with dissociation, I don't know, but just seems like that breathing and other grounding things can just generally be helpful. Is that right?
Absolutely.
Can you talk
whether
about
or not they're
how and what to do?
Say if we're talking, through a story with somebody and they're clearly getting pretty agitated and in a lot of pain, I might interrupt them, and I might even, in the beginning say, hey, I might interrupt you sometimes. I apologize in advance, so that I know I've set the groundwork for me saying, oh, they're flooding, because it's sort of two sides of the same coin. Flooding is just that absolutely overwhelmed with emotion, and then dissociation is the other half. So if someone's flooding, I'm going to stop midway and just say, let's just take a second, let's breathe, and I'm going to breathe with them. So the quickest breath work you can do is to have somebody breathe out, because everybody's told to breathe when they're anxious. And so you tell somebody who's anxious and they're breathing like this to breathe in, and they go, it's not useful. So have them breathe out, and I'll do it with them, like all the way. All you've done there is create a vacuum. So you might just focus on the exhale for a couple of seconds. Slow it down. You can count. Let's do that for 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. You're doing that with them, not even focusing so much on the inhale. Then you can get to something like a belly breath, which if some people have done yoga, they might know that. What I often do is I'll have somebody put a hand on their chest and a hand on their stomach and say, see if you, as you take a breath in, see if you can only move the bottom hand. So try that with me. That means as you breathe in, you're going to stick your stomach out. So you might notice my top hand doesn't move, but I can't see my other hand. But like anyway, breathing out. The nice thing about a more complicated breath work like that, belly breath actually gives you the most oxygen you can get. So that's kind of helpful, but it gives them something to think about that's not the trauma. So again, you're changing the channel a little bit. So to be able to say, let's put your hand here and see if you can keep this hand still while your bottom hand goes out and in as you breathe out and in and out. And here's the quickest grounding in the world. Take your finger, pad of your finger, touch the tip of your nose. Do you feel it on the nose or on the finger? Now, those both have a lot of nerve endings, so that's the answer. It doesn't matter what the answer is. It's just that they're going, huh? Let me think, right? So you have to think, do I feel it on my nose or my finger? It's just a nice little short reboot. You can also do that on eyebrows and earlobes. And again, the answer doesn't matter. It's just that they're focusing on themselves.
Yeah.
Should we talk more about other kinds of grounding as well, or stick with breath?
Let me just say that, I don't know if it was you or other people have talked about things like squeeze balls. So
yeah,
we keep that in the office now.
Good.
And
balls, great. Yeah. Somebody
recommended to me having these stones, so I got some at the gem show, and I just let them pick one, and they can be rubbing it with their fingers while they talk to me. And if I can bring them back to, like, let's talk about how your stone feels or something like that.
Yeah. And that's not limited to trauma, especially people who have ADHD are going to find that super helpful. Something to do with your hands. Teenagers too want something to do with their hands, or doodling or something.
Or fidget spinner.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
I want to say, this gets very intimidating and can be overwhelming to law students who are also worried about the elements of the offense and getting the story and all of this. It kind of seems a bit much to also manage. What do I say? Can you give us, you gave a little bit, but like sort of more things about, for the student who just feels like, oh my God, this person is really emoting, and I want to show that I really do care. I just don't know what to say.
Well, first of all, I really think that your intention comes through. So if you want with all your heart to be helpful, that helps. And so it's not important that you know exactly what to say. You don't have to know what to say. But if you're another human being in the room with them, and you're not scaring easy, that's helpful. Sometimes I'll say stuff like, wow, that sounds so overwhelming. I often, this is just my personal preference, so many people who've gone through terrible things have been told you're so strong. People don't feel strong, and they don't really want to hear that. But I might say, wow, you have made it through so many things and you're still vertical. That's amazing. So that you're just honoring their resilience. You can say, it looks like this is really overwhelming. I get that. That's normal. Just, it's okay. We can take your time, take a breath, cry all you want. I mean, I'll tell people that, like, just take a second and cry, because people think I have to keep telling the story while they're crying. And I'm like, no, just take a second, cry for a minute. And just acknowledging this is a big deal. I know this is painful. You can say, you know, this looks like it's so hard. I know you're working so hard right now. And so just whatever we can do to take this at your pace, it's fine.
And thank you for sharing that. I know that was really hard to talk about.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you know, it's tricky to normalize something without dismissing it. So you don't want to say, oh yeah, that happens all the time. But you do want to say, like, yeah, I absolutely get it. If you've lived through something like that, I'd be crying too. You know, that makes sense to me. So think about these sort of key pieces just to get it across. Your reaction makes sense. There's nothing wrong. You're free to cry. You're free to have your reaction. So all those sorts of things. You can also, if someone's really kind of coming apart, sometimes people find it really comforting if, say, you were to put a hand on their shoulder, but be oh so cautious with that. Because if somebody's in a really emotive state, it can sort of spark that exaggerated startle, especially if it's a person of the opposite gender or if they've been harmed by somebody, blah, blah, blah. So if you ever touch a client, ask their permission. I mean, besides like shaking their hand. Like, you know, if someone's, you know, is it okay if I touch your shoulder? And I'm kind of judicious with that. I want to make sure that there's Kleenex handy, but I don't want to shove Kleenex at them because I don't want to give them the message, stop crying.
I'm glad you remind us about the tissues because we always forget, and they're important to have handy.
Oh my goodness, yeah, don't start a trauma session without Kleenex.
No.
You can also do things that help them ground. So besides the stones, besides breathing, what you're trying to do with grounding, particularly if they're a little dissociated, is to get them two things: in the room and in their skin. Use people's five senses because they know them, right? You know, just go through them. So you can say, you know, find 5 things that you can see in the office. How many things can you hear in the office? What can you smell in the office? You're using that language in this room. You want people orienting to that room. So going quickly through people's senses. You can do one way to sort of soothe somebody without having to touch them is having them soothe themselves. This is a butterfly hug. It comes from EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It's trauma treatment. So you just hook your thumbs and you're just going back and forth. You might match your heartbeat. So you might ask them to say, you know, just imagine what your heartbeat is doing right now and match it, and then go slower and slower and slower. It just feels soothing. Sometimes you just let them pat themselves like this and it just feels comforting.
I gotta say, if you're watching, you should do this because it feels really calming.
It's very soothing, yeah.
Thank you. Maggie, students often worry about whether they're going to do harm. Mm-hmm. by you know, it's painful for people to go back through these experiences. The students are not psychologists. And, you know, maybe even if they were, it's just the concern about, am I doing harm to this person?
Such a great question. The simple truth is that for a lot of people, telling this story again is re-injury. And there's no way around it because you need the story. So it's not like you're going to harm them forever. It's just going to be really hard and painful for them to have to go through it again, because it's going to evoke a whole lot of the same processes physically that were happening at the time. So just kind of knowing that and saying, look, we have to sort of do a cost-benefit analysis. It's painful for them, but it is in their best interest and it can help you represent them best. Past that, I mean, you're not going to damage somebody. I do think, again, this is one of those times where you being present matters. Your intention of being helpful matters. So it's not like you have to know all the finesse. This is exactly how I do. If you're there with them, it's not about having the answer. It's about having the presence. So if you're there and if you're calming yourself down, that's going to be important.
And of course, if they win in an immigration case, it's going to be like a part of their healing too. And obviously, there's no guarantees.
There's a lot of people who say that therapeutically, just telling the story is therapeutic. So it's tricky. It's not like saying, oh gosh, we have to win this case for this to be useful to them. There are a lot of people who are walking around with something I call terrible knowledge. Not my phrase, but it's just somebody who's lived through something so ghastly or so painful that most other people in the world haven't had that experience. So if you've seen something so horrifying, it's so alienating. Like, it's so lonely to say, I've seen the worst of humanity, and you're all walking around going to Starbucks and, like, picking your kids up from camp and whatever. Like, it's such a disconnect. So just being able to tell their story and have someone all in and listening and believing them and saying, wow, that sounds so painful, that in itself can be healing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we've definitely seen it. We've definitely seen where somebody has held that story to themselves, and the fact that they're believed, that they're telling their story, and that they're believed has really. I think that's
one of the biggest fears is that they won't be believed, and that's more pressing when they've gone through something horrific. Because the worse the trauma, the more sometimes people think no one will believe this. It's too ghastly.
So that brings me to this last question I have, which is, we're in the room with somebody who's in a lot of pain if they're telling us this horrible story. Can we keep this from rubbing off on us? Can we keep this from affecting us? And if not, how do we deal with it? This is I'm asking for a short answer because we could have an hour or more on this.
Yeah. Well, yes and no. So a couple of things to consider. One, we're human beings, and vicarious trauma is a thing. So without getting into all the brain science here, whether you experience or see or hear about a trauma, it's landing in a really particular part of your brain, which I think is fascinating. It's the disgust center in your brain, part of an evolutionary part of our brain. So you're hearing things that are literally disgusting. I don't mean that as a judgment. I mean, like, it lights up that part of your brain. So that's going to have an effect on the clinician, on the lawyer, and on the client. So we've got to talk about what you do that takes care of you in the moment, that helps you take care of you and the client at the same time, and then what you do when you go home. So let's talk about in the moment. That breath work that we're leading them through? Oh my God, do it yourself too, right? You're going to need to breathe. You're going to need clarity. So to be able to say to yourself, I'm doing a job for this person. It's helpful for me to hear this person. It's almost like tagging in your own intention, right? I'm hearing something ghastly, but I want to help them. I'm here to help them. It's part of my process here. And sometimes, you might have to take a break. If you're hearing something that's really challenging, let's get to a second piece here. We're sort of presupposing that the client has gone through trauma and we have not, and that's rarely true. Most of us have experienced painful things. A lot of us have been through sincere trauma ourselves. If you still have trauma work to do, then your work is going to get Velcro to theirs. So one of the most important things you can do is do your own work, ongoing work. See a counselor, see a pastor, talk to somebody, continue to do your own therapeutic work, because trauma work is cyclic work. So even if you've done a fair amount of your own therapy or counseling, if you hear something that's very similar to your own story, it's going to light that on fire a little bit. So just having a place to debrief. And so once you leave that office, what do? Most people build up kind of rituals around it. So I know a lot of folks, like, they have the ritual of coming home at the end of the day and showering and washing off the day. They might have the ritual of coming home and setting everything from work down and playing with their dogs or playing with their kids. They might have a ritual of saying, I'm going to, drive home from work and sing really loud, or, play music that's calming or that's rambunctious or whatever. You can decide which of those things feel most centering and grounding for you. It's kind of funky too, because you might go days, months, years and say, wow, I'm handling this really well. I'm pretty insulated from it. And then one story is going to weasel its way in, and then boom, now you're dealing with vicarious trauma. And actually some of the same symptoms are the same symptoms of PTSD: insomnia, nightmares, irritable, edgy, jumpy, trying to avoid drugs and alcohol. Yikes, that gets costly. So be aware of all of those things for yourself. There's another kind of cool thing. This is also an EMDR thing that you can do with them and you too. So this is sort of a thought experiment. It's called a container exercise. So I'll do it and you just play along, right? You don't have to answer out loud. But what I'd say to the clients, say, okay, I want you to imagine a container, real or imagined, maybe something you've seen or never seen before. It's just the most secure container in the world, and it's only accessed by you. So take a second and tell me when you've got that. So I wait for them. Okay. So, and then I'll say, describe it to me just a little bit. So maybe they say it's a wooden chest, or it's a, one of those sci-fi, briefcases, or it's a shipping container, whatever. It doesn't matter what it is. And I say, okay, so, now notice the way it secures, the way it locks, and make sure only you can get in it. And so then I'll say, okay, so take little bits and pieces of all of the stuff we're talking about today. I want you to stow it in your container. I want you to seal the container and let me know when it's secure. And then you just wait, and they go, And sometimes they'll say it won't fit or whatever, but generally speaking, it's a kind of a nice way to say, and I'll say to them, this is for, like, say you wake up at 3 a.m. and you don't want to think about this. Put it in your container and seal it. Or if you're trying to work and those thoughts are sneaking in, put it in your container and seal it. That can work for them, but it can work for you too. So if it's 3 a.m. and you're thinking about your client, you're thinking, holy cow, I got to get to bed. Then you can imagine your own container. And it's not like I'm never going to get back to this. It's just, I'll get to you on my time. So using sometimes like imagery like that can be super helpful for you and for them. One final thing in terms of taking care of yourself, we're talking about all of these self-care practices, but there's such power in doing things that bring you joy, things that you look forward to, things that are an absolute change of pace. So if you say, I'm going to be talking about really intense things at work, but then I'm going to hike because I look forward to it, or bake bread, or go kayaking, or dance, or whatever, filling your life with things that really light you up can mitigate over time the effects of hearing really dreadful things.
Maggie, there were a couple of things that came up that we didn't get to. One is the idea of, you've been getting all of this input and you're going to want to out with it. And we don't want to really, cause secondary trauma to other people in our lives.
Right. So helpful to have a group of people with whom you can do that, though. So a group of peers, or like a consultation group, because no, you don't want to tell your mom or your spouse or whatever, especially really, really tough stuff. But you also don't want to be this bucket that gets full of this, because it can be hard. So I know I can say for me, I've been in consultation groups, twice a month for 20 something years, and it's invaluable. It's the place I take the stuff that I can't tell anybody else. So
Right.
maybe you even have a peer at school, like as you're a student, maybe you have a peer and you say, okay, we're going to do this group and this is what happened. And I'm imagining in the classes, they have a chance to, talk about some of it.
Yeah. And if you're in the workplace, then, ideally the workplace is you'll have colleagues where you can make space to support each other with that.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. Don't try to contain it all yourself, because eventually you'll get full.
Another thing I wanted to say is that if it is at all possible, when the client is working with us on their story, their declaration, their application. If they can be working with someone like you at the same time,
Oh, yeah.
so much the better. Like if we can hook them up with support.
Boy, if they have access to therapy, or they can be talking about this stuff and sorting it a little bit and figuring out, the meaning of it for them, then, oh, goodness, so helpful for them and for you, I imagine.
Okay. Well,
Yeah.
Maggie, this has been wonderful. You've given us so many helpful tools, and I really appreciate it. I just want to thank you so much for your time and for doing this.
Oh, you betcha. Absolutely. Thanks for having me.